The way someone treats you when they think you don't matter tells you everything. The low hum of conversation drifted through the diner, punctuated by the soft clink of silverware and the occasional hiss from the coffee machine, warm yellow lights casting a gentle glow over worn leather booths and polished countertops that had seen better days, but to Lily Carter, none of it felt warm, not tonight. Not with her heart pounding just a little too fast and her fingers gripping the edge of her order pad like it was the only thing keeping her grounded as she forced a steady breath and stepped toward table 12 where the tension had already begun to ripple outward like a storm brewing in plain sight. The man sitting there sharply dressed, his jaw tight, his voice raised just enough to turn heads without crossing the line into a scene, and across from him an untouched plate sat like evidence of something gone wrong. "I asked for medium rare, not whatever this is," he said, his tone clipped, impatient, and Lily could feel every pair of nearby eyes flick toward her. Waiting, judging, anticipating the fallout, because everyone knew how this went. One wrong word, one defensive tone, and the situation would spiral, and Lily couldn't afford that, not tonight, not ever, so she softened her shoulders, let her voice settle into something calm, almost gentle. "I'm really sorry about that, sir. Let me fix it for you right away." No edge, no argument, just quiet control, but the man wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, his frustration sharpening. "You people always say that, don't you? Just fix it, like it doesn't waste my time." And for a fraction of a second, something flickered in Lily's eyes, not anger, not even hurt, just the weight of a long day, of double shifts and overdue bills and the quiet fear of slipping behind on rent again, but it disappeared as quickly as it came, replaced by something steadier, something practiced. "You're right, your time matters," she said, her voice still even. "Let me make sure we get this exactly how you want it, and I'll personally check it before it comes back out." There was no defensiveness in her tone, no hint of resentment, just sincerity that felt almost disarming, and that was when Ethan Cole, seated alone at the counter just 10 feet away in a simple dark jacket that hid every trace of who he really was, looked up from his coffee for the first time, his attention sharpening as he watched the exchange unfold, because he had seen this before, hundreds of times across dozens of locations, employees cracking under pressure, snapping back, escalating situations that cost more than just a bad review. But this was different. There was something about the way she held herself, the way she absorbed the tension without letting it define her, like she understood something deeper than policy or training manuals, like she saw the person beneath the frustration. And as the man at table 12 exhaled sharply, his anger losing just a fraction of its edge, "Fine, just make it right," Lily nodded once, not triumphant, not relieved, just steady. "I will," she said quietly before turning toward the kitchen. Her steps measured, controlled, as if nothing had happened at all, but Ethan didn't look away, his gaze following her, something thoughtful settling behind his eyes, because what he had just witnessed wasn't just good service, it was consistency under pressure, and that was rare enough to make him set his coffee down slowly, rare enough to make him lean back slightly and take in the entire room with a new perspective, because sometimes the most important things didn't happen in boardrooms or strategy meetings. Sometimes they happened in places like this, where no one thought they were being watched, and as Lily disappeared through the kitchen doors, Ethan's lips curved just faintly, not a smile exactly, more like recognition, because without realizing it, she had just passed a test she didn't even know existed. Lily did not slow down when the kitchen doors swung shut behind her, but the moment the noise of the dining room dulled into the background, she exhaled quietly, pressing her lips together as she set the plate down under the heat lamps and called the order back with careful precision, her voice steady even though her hand still carried the faint tremor of adrenaline. Because this was not just another complaint, not when one mistake could mean a write-up, not when a write-up could mean fewer shifts, and fewer shifts meant rent that did not get paid on time, and rent that did not get paid meant starting over somewhere smaller, somewhere colder, somewhere she had already promised herself she would not go back to, so she checked the steak herself, leaning in slightly, making sure the center was exactly right, a soft pink that held its warmth without bleeding out, and only when she was certain did she nod once and signal the line cook. "Thank you," she said quietly, not out of obligation but habit, because respect was something she gave even when she did not receive it, and that was something people rarely noticed, except tonight someone had, because out at the counter Ethan remained exactly where he was, his coffee now untouched, his attention no longer drifting but fixed, observing not just what happened in the open but what followed behind the scenes, the details most people ignored, the consistency between pressure and privacy, and that was where the truth usually lived. he watched as Lily picked up the corrected plate, paused for just a second, and adjusted the garnish with the edge of her fork, a small, almost invisible gesture that had nothing to do with avoiding complaints and everything to do with pride. Then she stepped back onto the floor like nothing had happened at all, her expression composed, her shoulders relaxed. "Here we go, sir," she said, setting the plate down with careful placement, "not too fast, not too slow. I made sure this one is exactly medium rare." The man glanced down, cut into it, and this time the tension in his posture eased, just slightly, enough that the room seemed to breathe again. "That is better," he admitted, his tone no longer sharp, and Lily nodded once, not seeking praise, not lingering for validation. "I am glad to hear that," she replied simply before stepping away, already moving on to the next table, the next order, the next moment that needed her attention, and that was when Ethan stood, not abruptly, not in a way that would draw attention, but with quiet intention. He reached into his pocket, placed a few bills under his cup, more than enough to cover what he had ordered, and walked toward the exit. But just before he pushed the door open, he glanced back once more, his eyes finding Lily across the room as she laughed softly at something an elderly couple said, the tension from earlier completely gone, as if it had never touched her at all. And for a moment he studied that, the transition, the resilience, the way she did not carry negativity from one interaction into the next. And that was when something settled in his mind, not a decision yet, but the beginning of one, because this was not a single moment of grace under pressure, this was a pattern waiting to be confirmed, and Ethan had built his entire life on understanding patterns, on finding the rare ones that others overlooked. So as he stepped out into the cool evening air, the faint city noise wrapping around him, he pulled out his phone and paused, his thumb hovering for just a second before he sent a short message, simple, direct. "I want a full report on location 23, staffing, management, and customer feedback, starting tomorrow." Then he slipped the phone back into his pocket, his expression unreadable, because if what he had seen tonight was real, if it held under pressure, repetition, and time, then Lily Carter was about to become part of something far bigger than a late shift at a small diner, even if she had no idea yet that her life had just shifted by a few quiet inches in a direction she could not see. The next morning arrived without ceremony, just the pale light of early sun slipping through thin curtains as Lily Carter stood at a small kitchen counter barely wide enough for a coffee maker and a cutting board, her hair loosely tied back as she counted out a few dollar bills with quiet precision, her lips moving faintly as she calculated what remained after rent, utilities, and the medication refill she would need to pick up later that week. And for a moment she paused, staring at the numbers as if willing them to stretch just a little further, but they did not, they never did, so she folded the bills neatly, slipped them into her worn wallet, and reached for her keys, her movement steady, controlled, because hesitation was a luxury she could not afford, not when every day followed the same narrow margin between holding on and slipping back. And by the time she stepped into the diner for her next shift, the familiar hum of voices and clatter of dishes wrapped around her like routine armor, predictable, manageable, safe in its own way, even when it was not easy. "Morning, Lily," called out Marcus from behind the counter, sliding a fresh pot of coffee into place, and she gave him a small smile, the kind that did not require energy she did not have. "Morning," she replied, tying her apron with practiced efficiency, her fingers moving automatically as her mind settled into the rhythm of the day ahead. Orders, refills, small talk, small problems, all things she knew how to handle. But what she did not know was that across the street, inside a parked sedan with tinted windows that revealed nothing from the outside, Ethan Cole sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the entrance of the diner as he reviewed a digital report glowing faintly on his tablet, columns of data scrolling past, customer satisfaction scores, employee retention rates, complaint logs, numbers that told one version of the story, a version that looked acceptable, stable, unremarkable. But Ethan had never built anything by trusting numbers alone, because numbers did not capture tone, or patience, or the split-second choices that define character, and that was why he was here again, not in a suit, not with an entourage, but alone, watching, waiting, testing whether what he saw last night had been an exception or something deeper. And after a few minutes he stepped out of the car, adjusted the simple jacket he wore, and crossed the street with the same quiet presence as before, unnoticed, unremarkable, just another customer, the bell above the diner door chiming softly as he entered, and inside nothing had changed. The same warm lights, the same hum of conversation, the same steady pace, except this time Lily noticed him almost immediately, not because he stood out, but because something about him felt familiar, a fleeting recognition she could not quite place. "Hi there," she said as she approached, her tone natural, unforced. "Table for one," and Ethan met her gaze with a calm nod. "Yes, please," he replied, his voice even, giving nothing away, and as she led him to a booth near the window, he observed again the details, the way she moved without rushing, the way she acknowledged other customers with small glances and quiet words, never letting one interaction disrupt another, and when she handed him a menu, she did not linger unnecessarily. "I will give you a minute," she said before stepping away, efficient but not cold, present but not intrusive, and Ethan watched her go, his expression thoughtful, because consistency was beginning to form, not just in moments of pressure, but in the space between them, in the ordinary minutes where no one expected anything extraordinary, and that was where most people revealed who they really were. And as he sat back, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of the table, he knew this was only the beginning, because one observation was never enough, not when he was searching for something real. Ethan did not rush his decision, not in the way most people expected from someone in his position, because to him the difference between a good employee and a rare one was never found in a single moment. It was revealed through repetition, through pressure, through subtle variations in circumstance, and as Lily returned to his table with a glass of water placed carefully to his right, he offered a small nod. "Thank you," he said, his tone neutral, and she responded with the same quiet professionalism, of course, before stepping back, giving him space, and that was when he began the second layer of his observation, not dramatic, not obvious, just small shifts in behavior designed to test edges. "I think I am ready," he said a minute later, closing the menu, "but I have a few questions about substitutions," and Lily leaned in slightly, attentive but not intrusive. "Sure, what can I help with?" her voice steady, and he began with something simple, then slightly more complicated, changing sides, adjusting ingredients, asking about preparation methods, nothing unreasonable, but enough to create friction if handled poorly, enough to reveal impatience if it existed, and yet Lily did not rush him, did not interrupt, did not show the slightest sign of irritation. She listened fully, clarified when needed, and responded with calm confidence. "We can absolutely do that. It might take a few extra minutes. Is that okay?" she asked, and Ethan watched closely, because this was where many people slipped. When requests became inconvenient, when effort increased without reward, but Lily did not change, not even in tone, and when he nodded, she smiled softly, not exaggerated, not performative, just present. "I will make sure it comes out exactly how you asked," she said before heading toward the kitchen, and as she moved, Ethan shifted slightly in his seat, his gaze following not just her but the room, noticing how she adjusted her pace when passing another server carrying a tray. How she paused briefly to refill a coffee cup for a man who had not even raised his hand, how she acknowledged a child at the next table with a quick smile that seemed to settle the restless energy around him, and none of it looked rehearsed, none of it felt like something done for recognition. It was simply how she operated, consistently, quietly, and that consistency began to form a pattern that was difficult to ignore, because it meant her behavior was not reactive, it was intentional, rooted in something deeper than policy. And a few minutes later when she returned with his plate, she placed it down with the same care as before. "Let me know if everything looks right," she said, stepping back just enough to give him room, and Ethan examined it briefly, then looked up at her, holding her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, as if searching for something beneath the surface. "It looks good," he said, and she nodded once, "I am glad," before turning away, and as she walked, Ethan leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful, because the pattern was holding, not just under pressure, but under variation, under inconvenience, under the small tests that most people never even realized they were failing, and that was when his phone vibrated softly in his pocket, a message from his assistant appearing on the screen as he glanced down. "Initial report ready. Manager flagged for inconsistencies. Financial discrepancies under review," and Ethan's eyes lingered on the words for a second before he locked the screen again, his attention returning to Lily across the room, because now the situation had shifted, now there was context behind what he had seen, and context always changed the stakes, and as he picked up his fork, taking a slow bite, his mind was no longer just observing, it was connecting, because if the management was compromised, if the system itself was flawed, then Lily's consistency was not just rare, it was resilient, and resilience under a broken system was something far more valuable than simple competence. It was proof of character that could not be trained, only revealed, and as he set the fork down again, his decision moved one step closer to clarity, even if Lily still had no idea that every quiet choice she made was being weighed against a future she could not yet imagine. The afternoon moved forward in its usual rhythm, orders flowing in and out, conversations blending into a steady hum, but beneath the surface something had begun to shift, subtle, almost invisible, because while Lily continued her work with the same quiet consistency, unaware of any change, Ethan had already moved beyond observation into something far more deliberate. His presence no longer just that of a customer but of someone quietly mapping the structure beneath the surface and across the room. The manager, Daniel Reeves, stood near the register with a posture that suggested control but carried an edge of tension that only someone looking closely would notice, his movements slightly too sharp, his attention flicking too often toward the staff rather than the customers, and when Lily approached to input an order, he glanced at the screen, frowned, and tapped it twice. "You rang this in wrong," he said flatly, his voice low but firm enough to carry weight, and Lily paused, her eyes scanning the order quickly. "I followed the ticket exactly," she replied, her tone calm, not defensive, just factual, but Daniel shook his head, already dismissing her explanation. "Just fix it, and try to be more careful," he added before turning away, leaving no room for discussion, and for a brief moment Lily stood there, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the register, not frozen, not shaken, just processing, because this was not the first time, and something about the pattern had started to feel off, orders flagged incorrectly, totals adjusted without explanation. Small inconsistencies that did not quite add up, but she did not push back, not here, not now, because pushing back without proof only made things worse, and instead she corrected the entry, finished the transaction, and moved on, her composure intact even as a quiet question settled deeper in her mind, and from his seat Ethan had seen all of it, not just the words exchanged but the dynamics beneath them, the imbalance, the subtle misuse of authority, and when Lily walked away, continuing her shift without hesitation, his gaze shifted to Daniel, studying him with a different kind of focus, because the report from earlier had not been abstract, it had pointed somewhere, and now he was beginning to see exactly where, and as if to confirm it, a few minutes later a customer approached the counter with a receipt in hand, confusion written across his face. "I think I was overcharged," the man said, holding out the paper, and Daniel took it with a quick glance, his expression tightening before smoothing over almost instantly. "No, everything looks correct," he replied, his tone dismissive, already handing it back, but the man hesitated, clearly uncertain, and that was when Lily stepped closer, not interrupting, not overstepping, just present. "Would you like me to take a look?" she offered gently, and the customer nodded, relief flickering across his face, and as she reviewed the receipt, her brow furrowed slightly. "There is an extra item here that does not match your order," she said carefully, looking up at Daniel not with accusation but clarity. And for a split second the air shifted, tension threading through the space as Daniel's jaw tightened. "It is probably a system glitch," he said quickly, but Lily did not argue, did not challenge him directly. She simply turned back to the customer. "Let me fix that for you," she said, processing the correction with quiet efficiency, and as the adjusted total appeared, the man's shoulders relaxed. "Thank you," he said sincerely, and Lily gave a small nod, "Of course," before stepping back, allowing the moment to pass without escalation. But for Ethan the moment did not pass, it settled, solidified, because what he had just witnessed was not just kindness. It was integrity under pressure, the willingness to do what was right even when it created friction, even when it meant standing quietly in contrast to someone in authority, and that was when his decision sharpened, no longer forming but taking shape, because the system here was not just flawed, it was being manipulated, and Lily Carter was standing in the middle of it without even realizing the full extent of what she was navigating. And as Ethan reached for his phone once more, his expression calm but resolute, he understood that the next step would not be observation, it would be action, even if for now that action remained unseen. The shift should have ended like any other, with the slow tapering of customers and the quiet routine of wiping tables and stacking receipts, but that evening carried a weight Lily could not quite name, something subtle but persistent, like a thread pulling at the edge of her thoughts as she moved through her closing tasks with the same careful attention she gave everything else, her fingers folding napkins, aligning chairs, resetting the space as if restoring order could somehow extend beyond the walls of the diner, and across the room Daniel's voice cut through the calm again, sharper this time, directed at Marcus near the counter. "I told you to log the inventory before close," he said, frustration edging into his tone, and Marcus nodded quickly, apologizing, but Lily noticed the way Daniel's eyes flicked briefly toward the register screen, then away, as if checking something only he understood. And that small detail lingered longer than it should have, because it matched the pattern she had started to feel but could not yet prove, and she forced herself to look away, focusing instead on finishing her side work, because suspicion without evidence was just noise, and she did not have the luxury of noise in her life. But outside, across the street, Ethan remained in his car once again, the soft glow of his phone illuminating his features as a new stream of data flowed in, time-stamped transactions, discrepancy flags, internal audit notes that painted a clearer picture with every passing minute, and it was no longer abstract. It was precise, calculated adjustments, small enough to avoid immediate detection, consistent enough to form a pattern, and at the center of that pattern was Daniel Reeves, and Ethan leaned back slightly, his expression calm but sharpened, because this was no longer just about identifying a problem, it was about understanding its impact, and as he reviewed the numbers, one detail stood out more than the rest: Lily's transactions, consistently accurate, consistently clean, untouched by the discrepancies that surrounded them, like a fixed point in a shifting system, and that mattered more than anything else, because it meant her integrity was not situational, it was absolute. And inside the diner, Lily finished her final table, offering a soft goodnight to the last customer as the door closed behind them, leaving the space quieter, almost still, and as she walked back toward the register to clock out, Daniel was already there, reviewing something on the screen, and when she approached, he did not look up immediately. "You missed a step on table 7 earlier," he said without preamble, his tone controlled but firm, and Lily paused, replaying the moment in her mind. "I checked that order twice," she replied carefully, not defensive, just certain, but Daniel shook his head slightly. "Just be more careful next time," he said, dismissing the conversation before it could begin, and for a brief second Lily felt the familiar frustration press against her chest. Not because she needed to be right, but because something about this was not right at all, and yet she nodded, because pushing further would not change the outcome. Not here, not tonight, and as she entered her code to clock out, her reflection flickered faintly on the dark screen, tired but steady, and outside Ethan watched as the lights dimmed inside the diner one by one, his mind already moving ahead, because the pieces were no longer scattered, they were aligned: the flawed system, the compromised manager, and at the center of it all, one person who had remained consistent through every test without ever knowing she was being tested. And that was when he made the decision fully, not impulsive, not reactive, but precise. And as he stepped out of the car, the cool night air settling around him, he looked once more at the quiet diner before turning away, because the next move would not happen here, not in the open. It would happen where truth could not be ignored, where patterns could be exposed, and where Lily Carter would finally see the full picture she had only begun to sense, even if she was not yet ready for how much it would change everything. The next day did not feel different at first, not in any obvious way, and that was what made it unsettling, because Lily had learned that the biggest changes in life rarely arrived with warning. They slipped in quietly, disguised as routine, and as she tied her apron once again and stepped onto the diner floor, everything looked the same tables, the same hum of conversation, the same faint scent of coffee and grilled bread hanging in the air, and yet there was something beneath it. Something she could not name but could not ignore, a quiet tension that lingered just below the surface of her thoughts, and she pushed it aside, focusing instead on what she could control: the next order, the next customer, the next moment that needed her attention, because that was how she had always moved forward, one step at a time, without letting uncertainty slow her down. And across town, far removed from the small diner and its familiar rhythm, Ethan stood at the head of a long conference table inside a glass-walled room that overlooked the city skyline, the early morning light reflecting off polished surfaces as a group of executives sat in silence, their attention fixed on him, because the tone of the meeting had already been set before a single word was spoken. And when Ethan finally placed a thin folder on the table, the sound alone seemed to echo. "Location 23, he said simply, his voice calm but carrying weight, and a screen behind him came to life, displaying rows of data, transaction logs, flagged inconsistencies, patterns that no longer looked random when placed side by side. And as the information unfolded, the room grew quieter, the tension shifting from uncertainty to recognition. Because the problem was no longer hidden, it was clear, structured, undeniable. "This is not a system error," Ethan continued, his gaze steady as it moved across the room. "This is manipulation." And no one interrupted, no one challenged him, because the evidence spoke with a clarity that left no room for interpretation, and after a brief pause, he added, "The audit team will proceed immediately," his tone final, not open for discussion, and just like that the decision was set into motion, a chain of events that would reach far beyond the walls of that room. Even if the people affected had no idea yet what was coming, and back at the diner Lily moved through her shift with the same quiet consistency, unaware that every transaction she processed, every order she handled, was now part of something much larger, and as the morning progressed, a subtle shift began to appear, not dramatic, not obvious, but noticeable to someone paying attention, a new presence near the register, a man she had never seen before standing slightly apart, observing. Occasionally noting something down, and Daniel's behavior had changed as well, his movements more controlled, his tone sharper, as if trying to maintain control over something that was beginning to slip, and Lily noticed it. Of course she did, but she said nothing, because saying nothing had always been the safer choice, and yet something about the moment felt different, because this time the tension was not directed at her, it was spreading outward, touching everything, and as she handed a receipt to a customer and offered her usual small smile, her eyes briefly met the strangers across the room, and for a second there was recognition there, not familiarity, but understanding, as if he saw more than what was visible, and she looked away, continuing her work, but the feeling remained, because deep down she knew, even if she could not explain how, that whatever had been quietly building beneath the surface was no longer hidden, and that the next moment would not be like the ones before it. The shift did not slow down, but the atmosphere had changed in a way that could not be ignored anymore, not by Lily, not by anyone paying even the slightest attention, because the quiet presence that had appeared earlier was no longer just observing from a distance, it had expanded, multiplied, 2 more individuals now moving through the diner with subtle coordination, their conversations low, their attention sharp, and Daniel's control was beginning to fracture in small but visible ways, his instructions more abrupt, his movements less measured, as if the ground beneath him was shifting faster than he could adjust, and Lily felt it in every glance, every pause, every moment where something unspoken hung in the air, but she stayed focused, because that was what she knew how to do, and when a customer approached with a question about a bill, she handled it the same way she always did, calmly, clearly, without letting the tension around her change the way she treated the person in front of her. "Let me take care of that for you," she said gently, her voice steady, even as she became aware of footsteps approaching behind her, and when she turned, Daniel was already there, his expression tight. "I will handle this," he said quickly, stepping in before she could respond, but the customer hesitated, glancing back at Lily. "She was helping me," the man said, not confrontational, just certain, and for a moment the space seemed to hold its breath, because this was no longer just about a transaction, it was about control, about who was allowed to resolve what, and Lily did not argue. She stepped back slightly, giving space, but her eyes remained on the interaction, because something about it mattered now in a way it had not before, and that was when one of the unfamiliar men stepped forward, his presence quiet but undeniable. "Actually, let her finish," he said, his tone calm but carrying authority that did not need to be raised, and Daniel turned sharply, surprise flickering across his face before he masked it. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice controlled but strained, and the man reached into his jacket, pulling out an identification badge that he held up just enough to be seen. "Internal audit," he replied simply, and the words landed with a weight that shifted everything in an instant, because now the tension had a name. Now the pattern had consequence, and Lily stood still. For a second, the meaning settling in as she looked between them, understanding beginning to form in pieces, not complete, not yet, but enough to realize that what she had been sensing was real, and as the customer stepped back slightly, uncertain but no longer involved, the focus moved fully onto Daniel, whose composure was beginning to crack in ways he could no longer hide. "There must be some mistake," he said quickly, but the second auditor had already moved toward the register, pulling up records, reviewing transactions with practiced precision, and Lily watched as the screen reflected numbers she had seen before but never questioned, now being examined in a way that made their inconsistencies impossible to ignore, and she felt something shift inside her, not fear, not relief, but clarity, because the quiet doubts she had pushed aside were no longer just feelings, they were facts, and as the room settled into a tense stillness, the first auditor turned back toward Daniel. "We will need you to step aside," he said, his tone firm but not aggressive, and Daniel hesitated, just for a second, before nodding stiffly, the control he had held slipping away piece by piece, and in the middle of it all Lily remained where she was, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the counter, her posture steady even as everything around her changed, because she had not done anything different, she had not altered her behavior. She had simply continued to do what she believed was right, even when it felt unnoticed, even when it created quiet friction, and now, as the truth surfaced around her, she began to understand that sometimes the most important choices were the ones made when no one was supposed to be watching, even if someone had been all along. The diner felt quieter after the auditors escorted Daniel away from the register, not empty, not silent, but different in a way that settled into the walls and lingered in the air, as if something that had been held tightly for too long had finally been released, and Lily stood there for a moment longer than usual, her eyes resting on the screen where the transactions had been reviewed, her thoughts moving slowly, carefully, piecing together everything she had sensed but never fully understood. And then she did what she always did, she returned to work, because there were still customers to serve, still tables to clear, still moments that required her attention, and she would not let uncertainty take that away from her, even now, even as everything shifted around her, and across the room the auditors moved with quiet efficiency, documenting, verifying, closing a chapter that had been building long before she ever noticed it. And then the door opened, the soft chime cutting through the space as someone stepped inside, and Lily looked up instinctively, expecting another customer, another order, another routine interaction, but instead she saw him, the man from the past 2 days, the one who had sat quietly, observed carefully, asked questions without urgency, and something in her chest tightened just slightly, not fear, not discomfort, just recognition, and this time he did not blend into the background. This time he walked directly toward her with a calm confidence that felt different from before, and as he stopped a few feet away, his gaze met hers fully, no longer distant, no longer hidden. "Lily Carter," he said, her name spoken clearly, not guessed, not assumed, and she blinked once, caught off guard by the certainty in his voice. "Yes," she replied, her tone steady even as questions began to form beneath the surface, and he gave a small nod, as if confirming something already known. "My name is Ethan Cole," he continued, and for a second the name did not land. It hovered, unfamiliar in the context of this place, until it did, until recognition connected with everything around her, the auditors, the shift in the room, the quiet authority that had been present all along, and her expression changed, not dramatically, not outwardly, but in the way her eyes sharpened, understanding beginning to take shape, and Ethan watched that moment closely, because it mattered, how she processed truth, how she responded when the surface gave way to something deeper, and he did not rush her, he did not fill the silence, he simply stood there, allowing the realization to settle in its own time. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but there was something beneath it now, something more grounded. "You have been watching," she said, not accusing, not surprised, just stating what she had begun to understand, and Ethan inclined his head slightly. "I have," he answered honestly, and there was no apology in his tone, but there was respect, and that difference mattered, because this was not about catching someone off guard. It was about recognizing something real, something rare. And Lily held his gaze for a moment longer, searching for something beyond his words, and whatever she found there, it steadied her, because when she spoke again, there was no hesitation. "Why?" she asked simply, and Ethan's expression softened just enough to reveal the truth behind everything that had led to this moment. "Because you stayed the same," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "when it was easy, when it was difficult, when no one was paying attention, and when it mattered most." And the word settled between them, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just honest, and for Lily that honesty carried more weight than anything else, because it aligned with everything she had done without expecting it to be seen, and Ethan took a small step back, giving space, not closing distance. "There will be changes here," he continued, his tone shifting slightly, not colder, but more structured, "and I would like to offer you an opportunity to be part of that," and he did not elaborate further. Not yet, because this was not a transaction, not a simple exchange, it was a moment of choice, and Lily stood there, the noise of the diner returning slowly around her, the familiar world still present, but no longer the same, and as she looked at him, then briefly around the room, she understood something she had never allowed herself to consider before, that the small, quiet decisions she made every day had meaning beyond survival, beyond routine, and now, for the first time, that meaning was being reflected back to her in a way she could not ignore, and as she drew a slow breath, her answer did not come from fear, or doubt, or even hope. It came from the same place it always had, the quiet Certainty that had guided her through every moment so far, and whatever came next, she would meet it the same way she always had, steady, present, and real.